So, as most of you know, I've got the good fortune of having my sister Gail visiting from the East Coast here for almost a week. And she was just commenting about how the comments have changed from how we are clearly brother and sister to how we must be twins. We apparently look alike more and more every year, probably because of the wrinkles and gray hair and sagging skin that comes with our moving into our 60s. And kind of thinking about that whole process, growing up and growing older. And also just kind of noticing that at tea time over the past week or 2 weeks, the subject of Maranasati has come up a number of times, contemplation of death. People asking about that as a contemplation, because that's one that the Buddha recommended as a daily contemplation. And it's like just a lot of discussion and comments about why we do that. And it was just occurring to me that right now, I just turned 63, and it was just right around this time, maybe a little bit earlier than this, that our father developed thyroid cancer. And so it was very close to my age. And then he had it for several years, and he passed away, I think, at the age of 67, which Gail is just about to hit. So it just kind of is another one of those reminders. And our mother just passed away about a year and a half ago at the age of 92, just 6 days short of her 93rd birthday, I think. And so there you go, our parents are gone. We're getting into that age range where who knows what'll happen. Maybe we'll come down with something this year that will be leading us to the end of our lives. Maybe it'll be when we're 92 or somewhere in between or a few years after. We just don't know. But it's a recurring theme that keeps coming up. And a lot of people think, oh my goodness, Buddhism is so morose. All they talk about is death, contemplation, and suffering, and these kind of negative things. Why isn't it more life-affirming, more positive? And it is. It's just kind of comes about in a sneaky, around the corner kind of a way, because the Buddha consistently points out that the truth of the matter is that life is, not all peaches and cream. That there is a certain level of dissatisfaction, and in fact, some of it can be quite intense. Of course, there's the positive, the good that is in the world as well, that we seek to develop. But there are greater truths at hand, and if we own up to them and look at them squarely, then we have the opportunity to see them with a kind of wisdom that allows us to turn to something much deeper and much more profound as we get some insight into how it is that we usually live. We start to learn some ways to take refuge in something that's deeper, more peaceful, and in the end, much more reassuring and stable. So, it's the reason that the Buddha constantly encourages us to reflect on death, not as a way of scaring ourselves or dwelling in the morbid, but as in a way of preparing ourselves for actually what is inevitable, and not pretending otherwise. We have such a strong ability to put it to the side, particularly when we're younger and healthy, Body's got energy. The mind is inquisitive, bright, and alert at least in the intellect. And there's, even though there might be an acknowledgement that, oh yes, I understand that everybody dies, but there isn't a real deep recognition of this, because our bodies are telling us completely the opposite. The bodies are telling us, you're alive. You've got energy. It's not me. It's other people. It's my mother or my father, and we want to believe it, so we do. And if we're lucky, we start to get little hints of it, from time to time. Illnesses, body not behaving the way we want it to behave. And if we're very wise, we pick up on that and say, oh, okay, well, this is just a real um, temporary abiding here in a healthy body. But for the most part, even if we're somewhat wise, we don't we believe it sort of, but we don't really get it until things really start falling apart, either with others that are close to us, or ourselves. It's very hardwired. So as we get older and the body starts to get more tired or fall prey to more illnesses, kind of starts slowing down, then there tends to be more of these frequent reminders of really the importance of taking a closer look at this body that we assume to be ours, or assume to be ourselves. Uh, and people die in different ways. Like remembering our father, he had this cancer and had undergone treatment for it for a while in the beginning, and then really never recovered from the intense radiation therapy that he had. It was always it's kind of in a somewhat of a debilitated state, but seemed to keep plugging along until he had a kind of a sudden emergency with some regrowing tumor pressing on his carotid artery, causing a stroke. And nobody knew exactly what was going on. He was hospitalized immediately, put on life support, and we had the difficult decision and process of uh, getting all the information together, finally realizing what had happened, and having to go through the process of taking him off of life support gradually to see if he would survive on his own, which at the final moment he did not. But it was a pretty intense time, and um, it wasn't the most peaceful exit for him or for us. And it was also more than 25 years ago, and at least for myself, I hadn't uh, had some of the more reflective abilities that I do after having really taken on this practice more deeply. So maybe not quite as prepared as we were for our mother's death, which was, for many reasons, a lot more peaceful. She had a much more slow decline, that just kind of life force just slowly petering out over a long period of time. No major catastrophes or illnesses, just the muscles and the bones kind of slowly caving in, deteriorating, and her memory starting to slip, her judgment starting to slip, and just gradually needing more and more help, until, at least my opinion is that she just got tired of dragging around a heap of pretty non-functional bones and tissue, and it was just too tiring and too difficult, and she just, I think, lost the momentum to keep it all going, and just quietly stopped eating and taking fluids as much. Not, I don't think probably anything conscious, but more a sense of, okay, well, this is a way to check out peacefully. trade in for a newer model. And even though she wasn't all that particularly reflective towards the end, she had been somebody with some kinds of spiritual faith throughout most of her adult life. But in the last few years, it seemed like she kind of, I don't know if she abandoned it or just didn't think about it so much, but kind of more drifted into a don't know what'll happen. I'll see when I get there. Kind of um, uh, philosophical stance. In some ways, it may have been good if she were open about it. I couldn't hard to tell whether she was just moving into a more openness or more of a um, indifference. It was a bit hard to tell because of uh, her mental confusion at the time too. So I don't. It's one of those unanswered questions. But just noticing how people change over the years and how the quality of what they've put in and how they've lived and the suddenness or the chronicness of the illness, really all of these factors play into uh, how we pass away. And I know all of us here, want to be able to say, or want to be able to pass away with clarity and peacefulness and relative comfort. And I don't think there would be anybody who would want it otherwise. Um, but can we do that? Will we be prepared to do that when the time comes? So as time goes on and the body changes, it does become a little bit more obvious, and our reflections can grow a little bit more clear about what happens to a body. And are we holding on to that with a sense of possession? Or are we starting to realize that it kind of has a life of its own? And even though we can influence it bits and pieces, how much control do we really have? Uh, we can tweak it here and there and treat illnesses and try and keep it relatively healthy through diet and exercise, but inevitably it goes its own way. It's just part of nature. There is nothing in nature organically or inorganically probably that lasts. Everything has its lifespan, whether short or long or in between. And if we can own up to that honestly, then our sense of possession and sense of control will start to, or the wish to have that kind of control over this body, will start to diminish. Uh, and that's where you can find the peace, because even if it's the most sudden thing or the most gradual thing in the deterioration process, if we're prepared that it shouldn't be any other way, then the grasping or holding or clinging to this body is something that should be under my control. That will diminish. And every little bit that we can release around our self-possession of this human form, every little bit that we can do that will help towards a more peaceful departure when the time actually comes. Because if we can let go now, then we don't have to have it ripped away from us later. So it's one thing to start working with the body along the lines of the death contemplations, but a little more difficult for most of us around the mind. Um, we have much more of a fear in some ways of losing control over our mental faculties than our physical body. It's not quite so obvious um, how that happens or when that happens. And sometimes, particularly in our culture, we identify very strongly with the mind. We think that somewhere within this mind, if not the body, is something that is um, hopefully permanent, long-lasting, or everlasting, unchanging. and that is what we can take refuge in. And the trick of the training is to realize that even the things that we conventionally call our mind, our feelings, our perceptions, our all of the mental formations, the thoughts, the emotions, um, and consciousness, awareness, all of these, in part or in total, um, we form some notion around them that this is who we are. There has got to be at least something in that that is a place where we can take refuge. Uh, and it's a lot harder to get our minds around really examining that and seeing if that's true or not. It's because these mental forces are much more subtle and they're changing so constantly. So that's the key, is to take up this contemplation of what it is that we normally assume to be ourselves, and examine that very carefully, and see if we can make that hold up. That's what we chanted this morning. We recited the English version of the Anatalakkhana Sutta, the discourse on not self. And the Buddha is taking the five disciples at that time, his first five disciples, through a series of questions and answers, trying to get them to see this truth very clearly about how we live under this assumption that somewhere within these aggregates of existence, these body, feelings, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness, how to see that um, you can't really find something that's stable and continuous and non-changing in any of those manifestations. So methodically um, taking us through one by one, a contemplation, a contemplative strategy, and not hesitate. I want to emphasize right now that you know the Buddha was never trying to establish a philosophy of not self that one has to pick up and believe in and hold as a metaphysical reality, that there is no self. Quite contrary to that, he would not make any declarations along those lines in that way. But what he did was use this contemplation of not self as a strategy, a contemplative strategy to check out our assumptions and work through one by one. Can I really assign this particular experience of body or mind in the category of something that could be regarded as impermanent, changing, unchanging, um, and will be something I can take total refuge in? And so he takes us through that step by step, and we get little hints of it as we start to contemplate it and bring it in. It's very hard to, because it goes against the current of our minds and of our desires to find something stable in this what we call the conditioned reality. We're very hardwired. In fact, this is why we exist, in a sense, is this because we have this strong underlying desire for existence and being, and so we will impute that on any experience that we can. And so one by one, he helps us to try and deconstruct that, but it takes a lot of time and insight and commitment, and um, also having the willingness to strongly quiet the mind down, quiet the normal ways that we just keep moving so rapidly through time and space, in order to be able to see it clearly and to be able to see in depth and from a very, very still place how everything is always changing. And this is the fundamental insight that we need to realize, that we need to understand, that everything that arises has the nature to pass away. Anything that moves has the nature to cease. And we not only have to believe that, some people say, oh, well, right, of course, everybody knows that, but to actually see it so deeply and so clearly from a very quiet state of mind that it is realized, not just cognized, but that it is realized. Um, it takes a lot of right effort to bring the right conditions into force that allows one to see that and to eliminate the obstructions to seeing that. So this is why it's a long-term path. And once we do see that, or get even just a little hint or a glimpse of it, um, then it kind of falls into place how anything that has this nature to arise, and we see that it has the nature to pass away, even in this very moment, how can we regard that as a place of refuge in something that's constantly changing? I mean, are we the same person that we were when we were 5 years old? The body is certainly different. Um, the thoughts, the feelings, the emotional experiences, the trends um, uh, are all just in constant flux, constantly changing. We're never the same person from one moment to the next. And when we see that deeply, we start to realize that there is no um, constant um, condition that we can point to as an ever-abiding essence. The essences are always changing. We are just this constant flow of essences, in a sense. Inclinations, tendencies, expressions of this drive for experience, this drive for becoming, um, to identify with something. And we start to see how the mind will find anything to hold on to, anything to cling to, just for a moment, to give it that sense of stability. And it's very scary to see when that stops and to realize that it is constantly changing. And the mind wants to resist that, it doesn't want to get into that. It's just all so hardwired in some ways that uh, it, we just have such a difficult time accepting that until we see it so clearly um, that it's that we can't believe it anymore. The enchantment falls away with trying to find that kind of um, refuge, trying to find permanence and stability in a world that is inherently impermanent and unstable. And once we truly understand that, and don't let the fear and the anxiety overwhelm us with something like that, then we can relax enough. The mind will open up enough to see something more profound, something deeper below all of this activity of becoming, of identification. But it's until that sense of disenchantment and really, really seeing through the constant recreation of the world that we engage in. Um, it's only when we see it so clearly that we just don't have uh, the urge, the impetus to hold, to cling, to keep creating that illusion for ourselves. And then there's the opportunity to just let go. And what then becomes apparent is something that isn't part of the realm of the created. We did that chant this morning. Because there is the unborn, the unoriginated, the uncreated, the unformed, um, there is, because of that, we can learn to let go of the created, the originated, the formed. And we have a path to do that. So it's not a process of creating anything more, um, or finding that thing within the realm of conditions that is stable and secure, but more of a path of constantly, through wisdom, through clarity, seeing and relinquishing, and letting go of the urge to create something in its place. Because if we can just really continuously let go, and when we think that, in the words of Upasakagi, when we think that we've let go completely, we let go some more, because the subtle clinging is is well, it's subtle, is very subtle. That kind of holding, even onto very refined states of mind, is very strong. So the true path is one of creating skillful causes and conditions, um, but not taking refuge in the causes and conditions themselves, but just using them as a path. And this is like what we just chanted before the meditation this afternoon on the Noble Eightfold Path. If we're going to develop a sense of becoming or creation around anything, it would be creation of our lives around the Eightfold Path. We're still creating karma, in the words of the Buddha, and creation of karma is what keeps the path of becoming intact. But it's also an ingenious teaching of the Buddha's that it's an active process of a sense, an acquisition of uh, states of mind and states of action, the Eightfold Path. But inherent within it is its own demise. So that if we fulfill all of the factors of the Eightfold Path to their completeness, to the point where we realize the insight and the calm that comes from the right effort, the right mindfulness, the right concentration, and with reflection on the right understanding, with all of the other factors as a foundation, then in their culmination, in our culmination of understanding it, the whole thing can start to dismantle and fall apart and open to the unoriginated, the uncreated, the unformed. So it's an ingenious tape that self-destructs just by its very nature. And by fully developing it, it fully unravels. And even that, the Noble Eightfold Path, is something that we will then be able to let go of when we don't need it anymore. And then, people often ask, well, what's left? What does that mean? And the Buddha describes those in more sublime terms, more qualities of the ultimate peace or the ultimate bliss, the ultimate understanding, wisdom. It's not something that's definable so easily in words because it doesn't partake of the realm of words and the realm of concepts. It's beyond all of those. Pretty much what he says is follow the path and find out for yourself, and that it's worth it. So this contemplation of death is an excellent way to start because it provides that motivation for us to look beyond the temporary nature of this body, the temporary nature of who we are in the world, where we are in the world, the people that we have connections with, because in not too long a time, um, we'll be looking towards asking ourselves those questions quite seriously as we get the diagnosis or we find out that it's happening to somebody close to us or to ourselves. Then the questions keep coming up full force. And And that's why the Buddha says, well, contemplate it now, do it now before it's on you, and really keep making it a daily practice. And if you can overcome that fear, that anxiety around holding on to body or mind, and allowing ourselves to see clearly, to develop the path to see clearly and to relinquish and let go, then the sublime underlying truths will appear to us, and we won't have that fear, that anxiety anymore. And then the realization is of course, that death is just a process of being a human being, of being in nature, that all things that are conditioned have uh, the characteristic of arising, persisting for some time, and eventually passing away. And that as the teaching goes, in a chant that we do frequently, uh, in their complete passing is peace. A peace without any kind of clinging attachment anymore. So I think I'll leave that for this afternoon's contemplation.